Chapter 2. Ship's Duties. As we have now had a long spell of fine weather, without any incident to break the monotony of our lives, I may have no better place for a description of our duties, regulations, and customs of an American merchantman, of which ours was a first specimen. The captain is a lord paramount. He stands no watch and comes and goes when he pleases, is accountable to no one, and must be obeyed in everything. He has the power to turn his officers off duty and even to break them and make them do duties as sailors in the forecastle. Where there are no passengers and no supercargo as in our vessel, he has no companion but his own dignity and few pleasures. The Prime Minister, the official organ, and the active and superintendent officer is the chief mate. He is the first lieutenant, boatswain, sailing master, and quartermaster. The captain tells him what he wishes to have done and leaves to him the care of overseeing, of loading the work, and also the responsibility of its being well done. The mate also keeps the logbook, for which he is responsible to the owners and insurers, and has charge of the stowage, safekeeping, and delivery of the cargo. He is also the wit of the crew, for the captain does not condescend to joke with the men, and the second mate no one cares for, so that when the mate thinks fit to entertain the people with a coarse joke or a little practical wit, everyone feels bound to laugh. The second mate is proverbially a dog's birth. He is neither officer nor man. He is obliged to go aloft to reef and furl the topsails, and to put his hands into the tar and slush with the rest, and the men do not much respect him as an officer. The crew call him the sailor's waiter, as he has to furnish them with spun yarn, marline, and all other stuffs that they need in their works. He is one to whom little is given and of whom much is required. His wages are usually double those of common sailor. He eats and sleeps in the cabin, and he is obliged to be on deck nearly all of his time, and eats at the second table, that is, makes meals out of what the captain and chief mate leave. The steward is the captain's servant and has charge of the pantry, from which everyone, even the mate himself, is excluded. These distinctions usually find him an enemy in the mate, who does not like to have anyone on board who is not entirely under his control. The crew do not consider him as one of their number, so he is left to the mercy of the captain. The cook, whose title is doctor, is the patron of the crew, and those who are in his favor can get their wet mittens and stockings dried, or light their pipes at the galley in the night watch. These two worthies, together with the carpenter and sailmaker, if there be one, stand no watch, but being employed all day are allowed to sleep in at night, unless all hands are called. The crew are divided into divisions called the watches. One of these, the chief mate, commands the larboard, and the second mate the starboard. They divide the time between them, being on and off duty, or on deck and below, every 4 hours. This alteration of watches is kept up throughout the 24 hours, which is called having watch and watch. But our ship, like most merchantmen, had all hands from 12 o'clock till dark, except in very bad weather. Any explanation of the dog watches may perhaps be necessary to one who has never been at sea. Their purpose is to shift the watches each night, so that the same watch need not be on deck at the same hours throughout a voyage. In order to in order to effect this, the watch from 4 to 8 p.m. is divided into half watches, one from 4 to 6 and the other from 6 to 8. By this means, they divide the 24 hours into 7 watches instead of 6, and thus shift the hours every night. The dog watches come during twilight after the day's work is done and before the night watch is set. They are the watches in which everyone is on deck. At 8 o'clock, 8 bells are struck, and log is hove, the watch set and the wheels relieved, the galley shut up, and the watch off duty goes below. The morning begins with the watch on decks turning to the daybreak and washing down, scrubbing, and swabbing the decks. This, together with filling the scuttled butt with fresh water and coiling up the rigging, usually occupies time until 7 bells, half past 7, when all hands get breakfast. At 8, the day's break works begins, and lasts until sundown, with the exception of an hour for dinner. It may be well to define a day's work, and to correct a mistake prevalent among landsmen about a sailor's life. Nothing is more common than to hear people say, "Are not sailors very idle at sea? What can they find to do?" In first place, the discipline of a ship requires every man to be at work upon something when he is on deck, except at night and on Sundays. It is the officer's duty to keep everyone at work, even if there is nothing to be done but to scrape the rust from the chain cables. In no state prison are the convicts more regularly set to work and more closely watched. No conversation is allowed among the crew at their duty, and though they are frequently do talk when aloft or when near one another, yet they stop when an officer is at night. When I first left port, I found that we were kept regularly employed for a week or two. I suppose that we were getting the vessel into sea trim, that it would be soon over and we would have nothing to do but to sail the ship. But I found that it continued so for 2 years, and at the end of the 2 years there was as much to be done as ever. When first leaving port, studying sail gear is to be rove, all the running rigging to be examined, that which is unfit for use to be got down, and new rigging rove in its place. Then the standing rigging is to be overhauled, replaced, and repaired in 1,000 different ways, and wherever any of the numberless ropes or the yards are chafing or wearing upon it, their chafing gear must be put on. The next point to be considered is that all the small stuff which are used on board a ship, such as spun yarn, marline, seizing stuff, etc., are made on board. The owners of a vessel buy up incredible quantities of old junk, which sailors unlay, and after drawing out the yarns, knot them together, and roll them into balls. These rope yarns are constantly used for various purposes, but the greater part is manufactured into spun yarn. Another method of employing the crew is setting up rigging. Whenever any of the standing rigging becomes slack, which is continuously happening, the seizings and coverings must be taken off, tackles got up, and after the rigging is bowsed well taut, and seizing and covered be replaced, which is a very nice piece of work. There is also such a connection between different parts of the vessel that one rope can seldom be touched without requiring the change of another. You cannot stay a mast aft by the backstays without slackening up the headstays, etc. We add to this all the tarring, greasing, oiling, varnishing, painting, scraping, and scrubbing which is required in the course of the long voyage. And also remember that this all is done in addition to watching at night. Steering, riffing, furling, bracing, making and setting sail, and pulling, hauling, and climbing in every direction. One will hardly ask, what can a sailor find to do at sea? If after all this labor, after exposing their lives and limbs in storms, wet and cold, the merchants and captains think that the sailors have not earned their $12 a month, out of which they clothe themselves, and their salt beef and hard bread, they keep them picking oakum ad infinitum. This is the usual resource upon a rainy day, for then it will not do work upon rigging. And when it is pouring down in floods, instead of letting the sailors stand about in sheltered places and talk and keep themselves comfortable, they are separated to different parts of the ship and kept at work picking oakum. Some officers have so driven to find work for the crew and the ship ready for sea that they have set them to pounding the anchors and scraping the chain cables. The Philadelphia Catechism is, 6 days shalt thou labor, and thou all are able. 6 days shalt thou labor, and do all thou art able. And on the seventh holy stone the decks and scrape the cable. I'll try that one more time. 6 days shalt thou labor, and do all thou art able. And on the seventh, holy stone the decks and scrape the cable. Now one more time with a little bit more attitude, man. 6 days shalt thou labor, and do all that are able. And on the seventh, holy stone the decks and scrape the cable. Whatevers, man.